Ooh, we're live. All right. All right, guys. Like always, I'm going to just give it a minute. Um, and then I'm going to begin here. Let me see if I can do this. All right. Okay, just a couple more seconds, letting folks trickle in. Phew. Okay, well, let's. We should have invested in one of those light stands. Well, too late now. Okay, so I posted everybody's sending me kind of back work and stuff, and I'm grading them as we go. That's great. Keep doing that. Make sure I have everything, so when the exams comes, you're not kind of overburdened with back work. Reach out to me if you need any help. As always, that goes on. The days that I was I send you documentaries and movies and stuff. Do watch those, especially the ones that I put on the date that we have a lecture on. Then I put some supplementary stuff to see contemporary Iran and historical interviews and stuff like that, which are readily available on YouTube. But yeah, I really wanted you to see the terrorism incident of kind of former Kurdish separatists and stuff like that, just to kind of get familiarized with some of the realities of politics around the world. And this is, it's kind of important to keep in mind that this is not isolated to Iran, but we're learning about Iran, and it's good to know this stuff. So there's a couple of kind of contemporary events that are happening in US today and in the world that we need to talk about, but we're going to continue on after the Iran-Contra scandal here, right? And I kind of told you the details of what this whole deal was about these kind of two, just to summarize it and not to go into the details of the event, but just to kind of how I understand it, how I like to teach it, is like this idea of like two kind of adversaries, or between variety of national adversaries who need to stay at the adversaries in public eyes. Then they're doing these deals of international politics, right? They're very much kind of engaged with each other, U.S. and Iran, and they go through intermediaries, sometimes that being Israel, right? So it's kind of, this is very important in order to realize just kind of how the politics happen on international stage, and especially within Middle East, right? There are certain kind of facades that need to be kept up for certain political reasons and ideologies, and then there are political realities, right? And dealing with Israel, for example, the Iran like always has that, right? As in a way that it needs to kind of show up as it's supporting the Palestinian cause, if it even really does that or not, which sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, right? But all these nations have interests that they have to pursue. Yeah, so we kind of see this deal that is going through, and then kind of emerges on in the public sphere, and suddenly people are like kind of confused, right? Especially because on the American side, a lot of especially the Reagan administration, who had kind of came in right after the hostage crisis, has kind of decried Iran, right? And now it realizes how much it needs this nation, and vice versa, because Iran needs the United States. And then there are the alliances that are made during the Iran-Iraq War, right? In the beginning, for the most of the war, Iran is basically isolated, is fighting this um, uh, Iraq, right? A kind of struggle that has been kind of boiling there, that was waiting to happen. Just the question was with which country, um, which kind of comes up, and then the war happens, and then basically first Iran is isolated, and then Iran starts developing kind of new relationships with other nations, and one is kind of this kind of back channel with the United States, which we'll talk about more today, because in 10 years becomes very relevant again in Israel and other Arab nations who had if so. We're still working on the lectures, the PowerPoints about the Iran-Iraq War. I'm on um, the page with right after the Iran Contra. So you see Oliver North, you see kind of Elliot Abrams, you see Reagan and some of the folks around them, and a lot of these people are still in politics at this time. Another event that's kind of, it's really important to point out again, for my God, I can't clean my glasses today. For kind of contemporary events that happen at the beginning of this class is the USS Vincennes, I don't know how to pronounce that name of the ship, incident, which was on July 3rd of 1988. There was a Iran air flight that was going to a kind of a country in the Arabian Peninsula. I forgot where this plane was going. It was going from Iran to there, or from there it was coming to Iran. Nevertheless, near the Gulf, this U.S. ship shoots down this passenger plane. And this is right before the end of the war. Some people what this was a passenger class, so everybody dies on it. The problem is that at the time the U.S. never kind of apologized about it. There were discussions of first denial, and then maybe this was a mistake. And the captain of that ship was kind of awarded the Legion of Merit in 1990 later on, even though during the celebration, it was never kind of said that they did not say that, oh, we're giving you this medal for shooting down an Iranian passenger plane. But nevertheless, people in Iran took it as such, because first and foremost, there was never any apologies for it. And George H.W. Bush, which, it's interesting kind of read his campaigning, right? George W. Bush had this very kind of image problem when he was running as him being a sissy, right? This was a guy that had been kind of moving through the institutions, CIA ambassador to China, things like that. And, at the time of Reagan, there were kind of this emergence of a new right in the United States who were like, yeah, but will you be kind of the strong man that we want, that will oversee this new world that is about to emerge out of the kind of the downfall of USSR, which kind of gives the United States the mantle of the sole empire to rule the world. So nevertheless, for one reason or another, on the subject of this issue, Bush said that I will never apologize for the United States. I don't care what the facts are. And that kind of became the policy of the United States at this point, right? Because at this time, there were also a lot of the facts of kind of U.S. involvement in South and Central America kind of were coming up. But nevertheless, this event kind of went on to further kind of contextualize the discussion between United States and Iran, right? And especially, regardless of how powerful a government is within each country, they do have a certain set of supporters that they need to appeal to. And Iranians, of course, were just kind of very devastated by this attack, which kind of forced them to respond to United States as suddenly as an adversary, right? Of course, these are generalized statements; they're not true for everyone, but this kind of get the mood of the nation at the time. And another kind of important thing to point out is this MEK or Mujahideen Khalq, right? The people who kind of which was like an Islamist Marxist group that began before the revolution in Iran. They defected to Iraq during the war because the revolutionaries were at the time where these revolutionary factions were vying for power and kind of having the infighting. The Mujahideen, they kind of had a certain level of support, and there was this the Islamists were kind of very adamant to eliminate them. The picture that you see on the Mujahideen slide, that is Maryam Rajavi, and which is the wife of the leader of the group who's gone missing since the 80s. I forgot Rizwan Rajavi. I forgot his name, but nevertheless, nobody knows kind of where or who he is. But he was kind of an important player within the revolutionary politics before the revolution and a little bit after. But then they have to kind of run away to Iraq. Near the end of the war, actually, in kind of since the Kurdish had come, even Iraqi Kurdish on the side of Iran, the Mujahideen take the side of Iraq as a kind of a tool to replace the Khomeini's government within Tehran, and they kind of attack Iran, or they let Iraqi government use them as a proxy. This happens in Kermanshah, which is on the western part of Iran, and this is an attack that kind of decimates this group because Iran kind of shows up with a lot of force, and they basically kill about 4,500 estimated MEK members who were kind of pretty confident in numbers, and they were also kind of counting on, three things. One was that Saddam Hussein would back him up, which he did. The other one was that United States would back him. There were kind of a certain involvement as far as intelligence and weaponry and some other countries at this point, which also did happen. But the number one thing that Mujahideen were counting on was the support of the Iranian people, right? That, people will recognize us, that we are part of the revolution, that we're coming back, helping him to kind of remove this new tyrannical government. Iran at this point has changed. Like, if anything, as I talked about earlier, a couple of lectures ago, that this war has kind of led into this kind of a certain kind of the base support has congealed for this Islamic Republic, if you will, and its players, right? And nationalist sentiments that war always brings have kind of helped this. So Iranians immediately saw Mujahideen Khalq as kind of as traitors, as people who are attacking their own country. So they were met with a lot of hate. The picture I put on here is that with Giuliani, this is like a bizarre kind of coalition that has developed recently. This picture is from a couple of years ago where Giuliani went to give a speech to Mujahideen al-Hal, and because they're Marxist Islamist, right? And United States for a long time, even United States for a long time, consider them like a terrorist group because there are and always have been very much see themselves as guerrilla fighters, right? As that's how they kind of to in areas where political access is scarce, you use violence to achieve your means. But nevertheless, now they've kind of been accepted as a kind of a new American proxy in the Middle East in dealing with Iran, even though they don't have any support in Iran, as far as I don't understand it, nor outside it. This is kind of a development that we'd have to kind of wait a couple of years before kind of we look back and study, because after Mike Pompeo came into the United States government, he started making these kind of bizarre coalitions, which it's not bizarre because there's an ideology, bizarre because like you don't see like what the achievable political end is. You know what I mean? Like supporting groups that have no standing within the government or their people, or even have like political or financial power. Although there's a rise of kind of within some nations of kind of appreciation of kind of socialistic populist politics, right, in their democratic form, like as we've seen in for example, the elections in these past 4 years, the left parties have been losing very much so in a lot of countries. Yes, they've gained some ground somewhere, but neoliberalism still the even if we argue that it's kind of a dying order, is still electorally rules, right? Like Jeremy Corbyn, Labour Party got destroyed in Britain. We saw what happened with Bernie Sanders here. In Eastern Europe, I mean, the conversation goes on. So yeah, in the end, you like what kind of a militant kind of Marxist Islamics group would what kind of political benefits you would have as a proxy is kind of lost on me. But nevertheless, this discussion is available on YouTube. This conference, if you do Giuliani MEK speech in English, which is worth watching out. So yeah, so here's now. This is kind of where we want to move out of this war, right? We've kind of covered it for 2 weeks. I've said about pretty much what else is there to say, but it's kind of very important to keep in mind about about 250,000 Iraqis, like we're considering civilian and soldiers' lives, but in Iran, this is kind of 3/4 to a full million people. Now, these numbers kind of looked at like 5 or 6 numbers, and I picked this as the most kind of I think the best way to fall on this. But for example, there are people who consider the people that are like dying and suffering from chemical weapons as that's something that should be added to casualties, right? So this idea of counting the casualties of war is itself something in debate. So that is worth looking into. Like I have relatives that have been kind of affected by mustard gas. So they have respiratory problems and they have seizures to this day. And then a lot of them didn't survive. But a lot of children that we're kind of too young to fight off the effects of these things. So that's worth looking at, but heavy casualties, nevertheless. So and then the basically the war ends here, and Khomeini kind of famously says that, I have kind of drank from the chalice of poison, and calls off the war. There's a truth called, and we're kind of going into this new era. So I have uploaded a new set of slides under completed slides on your canvas. If you want to go ahead and bring it up, it is called After Iran After Khomeini, and you guys can kind of rest it on the first page. I'll give you a minute to go kind of grab it and bring it up. Okay, so we'll kind of go back to the war period a little more here, because there are a couple of characters I have to walk through the 80s into the 90s, but kind of we've closed our discussion of the war. So yes, in 1989, Khomeini dies, and then kind of new questions rise up. I want you to go. This is on that first page. You see these pictures of Khomeini's funeral. That's him in his grave. In Iran, people are buried not within a casket, and like Muslims are just kind of, you're buried in a sheet, a shroud, which is called the kafan, and then you're put in dirt. So there's no coffin in Islamic societies, but there's 6 feet, all that. But yet here he is put in a kind of a carrying coffin, and then he's kind of passed down. It's interesting to go look at his kind of the pictures of the transportation of his body, because at some points the thing got kind of out of hand, because there's so many people want to touch the body. They want to also pass it on to be taken and buried in a mausoleum that they built for him, or a mosque, Imam Khomeini's mosque, which is south of Tehran. Yeah, so it's an interesting scene. But so there's these couple of questions that I kind of want to, theoretical questions that I have to kind of bring up during this lecture on, because just to focus what kind of era this is, because this will be an era of a nation that goes through a revolution and is instantly within this decade-long, bloody war period that kind of defines its eternal politics, right? Of kind of a one party coming up and using the central government to rule, and at the same time it is defining what this kind of Islamic Republic is. And from another side, it kind of takes an antagonistic look to some countries in the world, and with some countries in the world it becomes kind of very close. So there are a couple of questions that people are asking at this time. If you look at the publications of near the 80s going into the 90s, that who's this government for, right? And what does that mean? Like, are the movements that were involved in the late 70s and 80s that are to carry on this government, right? Or the bureaucracies and institutions? The major parts of it, right? Some of them lasting from the Shah's period, even though a lot of them have been reformed. What about the markets and the heads of the industries, the capitalists, the landlords? What is their saying to this? For example, something to point out to is that for the first time in Iran, now that you kind of have this constitutional non-monarchy, but you have this kind of new system which has tiers, even though it has a monarchical kind of a role, which is the supreme leader, who's nevertheless kind of elected in an indirect way, which in my opinion is very circular because he's elected by the Guardian Council, and he kind of chooses people of the Guardian Council. But nevertheless, there are classes that are coming up here, like the Bazaris, who for the first time in Iran are independent, right? Because within the monarchy that Iran has lived, like there was law, even after the parliament, there are bodies of laws, there are constitutions, but really at the end of the day, the Shah was the last word, right? Like you saw this with the White Revolution, right? This was kind of a project of the Shah, right? Now he could find people in the parliament to either support him, and when he didn't, you saw that he would disband parties or close down the parliament or call for re-elections of parliamentary people. Uh, but nevertheless, like he is, the government is arbitrary because he's the sole kind of deliberator of the country, and this kind of within the White Revolution, for example, remember the land reforms, this idea that someone's going to come and say that, okay, so now all you landlords, you got to share this much with these peasants, or we're going to take these lands and we're going to give them to these farmers, or, oh, pastoral people, you can't take your, like, uh, your animals here because this is now public land, right? So when, regardless if you like it or not, when this is done arbitrarily by the Shah, it leaves this idea of, do am I mean, if you think about it through liberal politics, like, am I the owner? Am I are individuals the kind of the nexus of certain God given or government given? To me, they make no difference rights, right? For example, the right to private property, right? Because if your private property can be taken away, um, uh, just kind of arbitrarily, then that right doesn't really exist, right? So in another way, your very class as a property owning class becomes a class that is kind of can be reconfigured in a whim, right? As we saw, as it was attempted within the White Revolution. Now you might say, okay, so in the United States there is eminent domain, right? There is, Walmart comes and they want part of your road, or the government is trying to build a highway. They need a couple of meters off your land, you know. Regardless of how some people kind of make this sound like a tyrannical move, if the government comes and they want your land, right? For example, I hike a lot, right? And when you go to you explore the national parks here, you're about to see plaques, right, from these Appalachian communities that had existed there, and then kind of FDR comes and it's like, we want national park lands, which I like because I love hiking. A lot of people have lost their land and stuff, even though they were compensated, very compensated and relocated and all this stuff. And of course, some people weren't. Let's not get too deep into that. But nevertheless, in that in that world, there is a process, right? It's not like FDR came and says, now I shall take land off of all Appalachians and give it to so and so to make national park. No, there is a Congress, there is a Senate, there is a Supreme Court that is fought FDR with tooth and nail, and then FDR in return, in this idea that I'm going to pack the court. I'm saying all this because then like there are rights and there are people that can come and fight for you, even you might lose, right? So it is not arbitrary, right? As and I know that sometimes we kind of uh, fall into this to those ideological talks, right? That, oh, if the government can come and take my land and build a highway, then I never owned it to begin with. Well, that's not really true because you have a certain rights. There are courts, and also there's a nation and society, right? And these there are antagonistic kind of um, interest within a society, and they're pursued a different way, which sometimes the government loses, sometimes the individual. Now, within Iran, this has never really existed up until now, right? Up until this Islamic government that suddenly says that. Um, and remember, the Bazaarists, the Bazaarists, the people that were the merchants, were kind of some of the financial supporters of that revolution, right? And before that, they were kind of, and I use this without kind of meaning any harm by it. There was well, maybe I want to use parasitic, but maybe symbiotic is a better word, of the bazaars and the religious class, right? And they both also intersect as landowning classes, just because how these segments of society have developed through Iranian um, history. So now you have, for example, the Bazaris, and from there they're kind of small industries that are growing up, right? Even after kind of a nationalization of oil, and now there are producers, factory workers, factory owners, right? There's the capitalist class, right? Iran is kind of uh, uh, as these kind of classes are emerging, as Iran is developing, and suddenly they have a certain rights that they've never had it, and they are intent on using it. So all this said, it's like, do they get to rule, right? How are we going to do this? Or is it the real leadership, the guardians of um, the revolution of Iran? Like, for example, on that picture in that slide, this is the second slide in the after the Khomeini um, uh, PowerPoints. You have Khomeini sitting down. Next to him is Khamenei, which we've mentioned, who is going to be um, the kind of the person that becomes the supreme leader and takes the mantle of Khomeini. Next to him, his son Ahmad, who some people thought that maybe he would become the leader, but also there is Rafsanjani, who's become kind of a Iranian president. Khamenei, who's sitting in the middle, he was also a president. He was for a short period of time. Is it Ayatollah Montazeri, who thought he was going to be the next supreme leader, but he turned out to be too critical of how Khomeini kind of carried out this. This government, and what kind of country he produced in relation to resistance, domestic resistance, and international resistance in the war. So kind of these questions are suddenly very important. It's kind of worth to point out that in 1989, Khomeini instructs a council to revise the constitution once again, right? So Article 9 is kind of removed, so the supreme leader doesn't have to be Majad, right? Like a religiously kind of institutionally recognized religious leader to be the supreme leader. But on the other hand, the supreme leader is now the also a commander in chief. The prime ministership is changed to presidency. There's judicial reconstruction, which I come back to maybe even next lecture on Wednesday, and then he also kind of puts the council to oversee the Guardian Council, who's very important at this time. So yeah, so after the war, as you can see, the country's there's not a stagnation. Everybody's trying to figure out what kind of country we want to be, right? And even Khomeini on his last days, he's seeing. But nevertheless, after Khomeini's gone, and this removal of this idea of Majab being the only person that is allowed to be the supreme leader, a kind of character emerges who's been very much involved within the revolution, the war, and he was also a president at some point, which is Ali Khamenei, who was kind of a close associate of Khomeini. And Ali Khamenei is the one that you never really see. In the news and stuff, because he kind of comes and goes. He likes to keep in the background, but he's the most powerful kind of figure within Iranian politics right now. He was born in 1939. He's still alive. You never see his right hand because there was an assassination attempt early on in the 80s on his life, and there was a bomb that went off that kind of have really damaged his right side, so he usually hides it. You usually see his left hand and holding notes. When he likes to read off these cards. He's from Mashhad. That's important. He's not from Qom. He's not from that central part of Iran. But he does he does study in Qom, and that's how he's kind of within this Islamist circle that is empowered in Iran right now, right? And as you can see, as I've said many times, there are different factions. The Islamists are just the most powerful. When he becomes a leader, he's not a Majah. There's a council that kind of gives him that that qualification later on in 1994, after he's been the supreme leader for a long time. And the thing is that because he was in a Majad, a lot of people, especially from the Islamist circles, were not happy about that. This idea that there is this kind of a student that is becoming the supreme leader. He was also briefly the third president of the United States, about for a year, and he is one that is a successor to Khomeini. So it's important, even in the American media, there is this conflation of Khomeini and Khomeini all the time. So one is Khomeini, that's the first one. Khomeini, because he's from the Khomein region in Iran, right? This is Khomeini, right? It starts with A. Totally different thing. And they're not related. They're just from the same kind of political sphere within Israel. Okay, so the next person and another thing to say about Khomeini, when you look at his pictures from the 80s, he's usually in military uniform, fatigue. Like you don't. He kind of returned to this kind of without kind of wear that thing. That means they've had training within Islamist institutions to become for different kind of be it to be a judge or a theologian or to kind of lead a community, right? Like in a local mosque, right? So he kind of turns back on wearing that after the war. But during the war, you see his pictures, he's wearing kind of military uniform usually. And he was very much, God made a lot of his supports during the war, right? By always being on the front around people and kind of, so the military after the war saw him as kind of one of their own, or some of the important powers at that point. So next kind of, you can go to the next slide. The next important figure at this time is Akbar Hashim Rafsanjani, who was he died in 2017. He was born around the same time, 1934, and it's kind of important to keep track of these dates of when these guys are born and stuff, because at some point we're going to see a new generation of leaders, right? And every time we move a generation, there's a disconnect that happens that is important to point out to. So this is kind of 1930s. He's from Bahrain, Iran. He's the fourth president of Iran, and he is kind of the person that establishes the presidency within Iran. And he serves for 2 terms, and in Iran, it's the same thing as the United States, 4-year terms. And he is the president from 89 till 97. He was kind of head of a parliament in the 80s. He was very much during the war. He was very much involved with that. I think especially in connection to his economic side, he was involved within the revolution to some degree. Anyways, he's kind of a very important figure because he's one of those revolutionaries that kind of turns into a reformist in the 90s. And we'll talk about what kind of reformist means in the 90s at the point. Yeah, the other thing kind of important about Rafsanjani is that he does not come from a meek background. He comes from a pistachio growing family. They're very wealthy, and even him is estimated that he was a billionaire by the time that he died. But even his family and is almost all of them are very kind of involved within politics. Most like his wife, especially his daughter, who even like started a magazine, Zan, which is kind of a nod back at a magazine that was a thing famous during the Shah's rule, Zana Rus, right? Which was like the woman of today, or something. Rafsanjani kind of comes in and out with the kind of the conservative hardliner segment of society, the government that is the supreme leader, right? And the supreme leader, as I've said, has kind of access to the armed forces, big chunk of economy, control over oil, and because you have to kind of look at the Iranian government as this majlis, the parliament, the presidency, and then they're surrounded by this kind of very conservative institutions that see themselves as a way to curtail the democratic tendencies within society, right? Because you can't. Some of these people believe that too much democracy might lead to a form of liberalism that is anti-Islam. But what they mean is, people are trying to kind of stay in power, basically, regardless of what kind of religious tone these discussions take. So Rafsanjani kind of comes in and out of favor, right? I mean, there were times in his life when he's censured. His daughters went to jail, and these are they're Muslims. There are like, and this is the weird thing about talking about Islam, because you can't really get anything out of this talking about these different factions of Islam in Iran. Rather, like, who is antagonistic to what portion of society is how I have to learn to kind of be articulated, because when you get to the religious speak, you might go off the trail and the rails, if you will. But yeah, so Rafsanjani is because he joins this reformist movements, which I promise I'll kind of elaborate on later on, kind of comes in and out. But he's just a very important figure to keep in mind as this story develops for the 90s and the 20s. So kind of let's see where Iran is at the time that Khomeini comes to power and Rafsanjani comes to power as the president. So we're kind of and you're seeing by '94 where Blink Bill Clinton comes to power in the United States, which is itself is going to be kind of a different interpretation on how the world is arranged, right? United States, most powerful empire. You always have to talk about it when you talk about politics in other countries. So I've already talked about kind of the political questions, right? So, and when you talk about political questions, that's because there are people vying for different kinds of world, right? There are people that like there. I was born, for example, in 1985, right? So I was too young. So I was born during the war, after the revolution. My generation is not really a politically present thing for 20 years ago. But there are people that are kind of my parents, between my parents' generation and mine, right, that are coming to age within this end of the war, right? They were too young to remember the revolution, but they are becoming teenagers and going to their 20s and some maybe 30s after the war in the 90s, right? So these are the people who are like, don't really have too much memory of the revolution, right? They do remember the war, but nevertheless, they're also seeing this new world, right? The fall of the Berlin Wall. There is kind of people writing books about the end of ideology, right? That liberal democracy has won, so markets rule. Also, uh, uh, economic kind of freedom has to be extended to all, even though there is no economic and no discussion about kind of economic underlying of those kind of hours. But nevertheless, there are people that are being born in Iran that are suddenly like, okay, our parents hated a lot of this. Um, these kind of censorship, this antagonism against other parties, the stagnation regarding the women's rights, right, and the woman's role within society and within family, and they want a new world in a way, right? They want this liberal rights that are kind of being doled out around the world at this time. Um, so that's important to keep in mind, and I'll kind of talk more about that when we're talking about Khatami later on. Rafsanjani and Khomeini's Iran is kind of this is kind of the field anymore, regardless of how much you emphasis of constant revolution and perpetual revolution and all that. You have to come up with a more appropriate economic system, and this will be the time where there is this emergence of neoliberalism, right? This idea of that there's to put the crude way of it, as Thatcher would have put it, that there's no society, there are only individuals and their economic drives, right? So this is kind of the economic ideology that is developing within the 80s, especially with Reagan, and kind of Chicago School of Economics, and then they re-exported, right? Sometimes through funding of people like Contras or dictators in Chile and stuff, was sometimes through kind of soft politics, right? For example, for like breaking up the unions, right? Or kind of destroying segments of the segments of the working class that are not desirable as much, right? For example, Thatcher getting rid of the miners, which is one thing to point out. Or in U.S., you like there is. It is not an accident where kind of like people who are working in car industries, right? Their industries have to be kind of send off elsewhere, right? Because it's kind of developing this working class that has both access to money, their kids are being educated, and now they want kind of different political world. So all these things have to be reconfigured, or at least that's how I see it. So nevertheless, that kind of neoliberalism or markets rule ideology is also seen in Iran, right? That this kind of centralized war economy is not giving us enough, uh, creating enough kind of economic opportunities for us, so we need to liberate the market. The problem is that Iran is still kind of isolated, and it's even under embargo and sanctions by the United States still. So while a lot of the world players have in mind fresh memories of the hostage crisis, the Iranian Revolution. Then there's talks of Iranian partaking in proxy wars within Israel and solidifying its rule within Middle East, where there's a lot of oil, and oil is very much needed. People like the older generation who's in power has it kind of takes those political divisions seriously, but then there's like young people coming to the world that they don't really care about those the kind of fault lines, right? All they want is and more rights and more political kind of opportunities, right? So the new leaders, such as Rafsanjani, need to take account of those, right? That he's himself from another era, that his counterparts in the United States and European countries, or Iraq, are from a country that was kind of ravaged by war and has no industries to speak of, or a welfare system that can kind of encourage building families and buy stuff, right? You need consumers within a society. There's also a brain drain, right? A lot of people left after. A lot of the educated people left after the revolution, and now they're sending their kids out to go study and live other places where they have more freedoms and economic access. So this kind of also creates this environment where there are the bottom classes that are not the middle class, who are the beneficiaries of the amount of capital and that was and this being that some families made, because of living through the Shah's regime, right? They got education, they had houses, or a house, a car, and whatnot. They got to educate their kids. They themselves were educated, and now those people, a lot of them are leaving, right? And now this new kind of people who didn't see much benefit under the Shah's regime. Let's say they were their parents were peasants, and then they had to kind of come to Tehran and by war, and then all these technocrats and educated classes and people like that are leaving, right, and taking their money with them, right? So now you kind of have a certain attitude that is developing between different people that see each other within this country as who is this country for? You know what I mean? The people who can just like take the money and leave, or when the hardship takes off, leave, or the people who are always have to stay and deal with the aftermath of crises and kind of deal with the problems of everyday life within Iran. And kind of, I want to go and talk about the oil prices last time, because I've been following the oil prices today as we're giving this lecture. The oil prices have fallen to negatives. It's important to think about at that point, right after Iran-Iraq war, the oil prices have fallen to like under $20 a barrel. Iran was selling their barrels at $8 a barrel. Today they're negative. Like so, you and I are in for a new world. But I think I've said enough to kind of pick up this Rafsanjani's Iran on Wednesday. So yeah, I'm going to end this lecture here. As always, reach out to me, watch these documentaries I send you, try to finish your book, and start thinking about what you're going to do for your exam, because in a couple of weeks you'll have to start submitting those. Hopefully you've already started working on this. So whatever you want to know, let's talk about it now. One-to-one conversations over cam, we can email, we can talk on the phone, however that works for you. So let's go ahead and during these hard times help each other get those A's, and at least be ready for the world that is coming to us, that we're kind of very much in the dark with. Okay, guys. Well, thank you for listening to me, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Take care.